At 3:17 a.m. on February 9th, 1943, Cook Second Class Thomas Tommy Henshaw stood in the galley of the USS Bogue with his ear pressed against the bottom of a 50-gallon soup pot, listening to something that would either save the convoy or get him thrown in the brig. Through the steel, he could hear it, a rhythmic thrumming, faint but distinct, different from the destroyer's own engines. A pattern. 4 beats, pause, 4 beats. The frequency was wrong. The timing was wrong. This wasn't friendly. He had maybe 90 seconds to decide if he was going to run to the bridge and tell the officer of the watch that a cook with an 8th grade education had detected a U-boat using kitchen equipment, or if he was going to keep his mouth shut and let 47 ships sail into a wolf pack. The official U.S. Navy sonar protocol required trained operators, calibrated equipment, and systematic search patterns. Henshaw's method required a soup pot, silence, and the ability to tell the difference between a merchant ship's engine and a German submarine's diesel. The Navy had court-martialed 2 sailors last month for unauthorized use of detection equipment. What they'd do to a cook who claimed he could hear submarines through cookware, Henshaw didn't want to find out. But he could hear it, clear as day, and the convoy was 12 miles ahead. Thomas Henshaw grew up in Wheeling, West Virginia, where his father worked as a tugboat operator on the Ohio River. The family lived in a house 200 feet from the water, close enough that Tommy fell asleep every night to the sound of engines, coal barges, steamboats, pleasure craft, work tugs. By age 8, he could identify a boat by its engine sound alone. By 12, he could tell you if an engine was running rough just by the pitch. His father taught him the trade. Sound travels differently through water than air. You learn to listen through the hull, through the deck, through anything that touches the water. A good river pilot knows every boat on his stretch by ear before he ever sees it. Tommy spent his teenage years on his father's tug, the Mary Catherine, learning to navigate fog-bound mornings by sound alone. When the Depression hit, the riverboat work dried up. Tommy took a job at a diner in 1936, age 17. The owner, a Greek immigrant named Stavros, taught him to cook. Tommy learned to time dishes by sound, the sizzle of a steak telling you when to flip it, the bubble of a sauce telling you when it's ready. The kitchen became another river. Everything had its rhythm. He enlisted in the Navy in January 1942, 2 months after Pearl Harbor. The recruiter saw riverboat experience and cook on his application and assigned him to the galley. No sonar training, no combat rating, just a billet in the USS Bogue's kitchen, feeding 900 men 3 times a day. The Bogue was a Bogue-class escort carrier, converted from a merchant hull, commissioned in September 1942. Her job was simple: protect the convoys crossing the Atlantic from German U-boats. Her air wing hunted submarines. Her destroyers screened the merchants. And her galley, Tommy's domain, fed everyone while trying not to get torpedoed. By February 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was reaching its peak. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be built. In January alone, 37 Allied vessels went down. Convoys lost 10 to 15% of their ships regularly. The math was brutal. If the sinking rate continued, Britain would starve. By summer, the Navy's answer was better sonar, more escort ships, improved tactics. But sonar had limitations. It couldn't detect submarines on the surface. It struggled in rough seas. It required trained operators who were in desperately short supply. The Bogue had 6 sonar technicians for round-the-clock operations, 6 men to listen for submarines in an ocean full of noise. Tommy Henshaw wasn't supposed to be listening at all. But the galley was located on the starboard side, forward section, 8 feet above the waterline. The soup pots, 6 of them, 50-gallon steel kettles, sat directly on the deck plating. And when the galley was quiet, usually between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., Tommy noticed something. He could hear the convoy. It started on January 23, 1943. Tommy was prepping for breakfast service, alone in the galley. The Bogue was screening convoy HAs 224, 52 merchant ships bound for Liverpool. Tommy had a pot of stock simmering. Beef bones, water, vegetables. The pot was resting on the deck, not on the stove. He bent down to check the flame, and his ear brushed the pot's side. Through the steel, he heard engines. Dozens of them. The deep throb of Liberty ship diesels, the higher whine of tanker turbines, the rhythmic chug of old coal burners. Each one distinct, each one a different note in a mechanical symphony. Tommy stood up, looked around. The galley was empty. He knelt back down, pressed his ear deliberately against the pot. The sound was clearer, transmitted through the ship's hull, through the deck, through the pot. The steel amplified it, focused it. He could identify individual ships by their engine signatures. He didn't tell anyone. What would he say? "Sir, I can hear the convoy through the soup pot." They'd think he was cracking under the stress. Plenty of sailors did. The Navy had a term for it. Atlantic fatigue. You started seeing U-boats in every wave, hearing torpedoes in every clang. But Tommy kept listening. Every morning between 2 and 5 a.m., when the galley was quiet, he'd press his ear to the pots and map the convoy by sound. He learned to distinguish engine types, count propeller blades by their beat, estimate distance by volume. It became a private game. Identify every ship. See if his count matched the convoy roster. On February 3rd, 1943, he heard something different. Convoy SC-118 was 8 days out of New York. 41 ships, scattered across 15 square miles of ocean. Tommy was listening through the stock pot at 3:45 a.m. The usual chorus of engines, merchant ships at 8 knots, steady and predictable. Then, underneath, something else. A higher-pitched whine. Fast. Not convoy speed. And the pattern was wrong. Not the continuous drone of a merchant ship, but a pulsing rhythm. 4 beats, pause. 4 beats, pause. Tommy knew that sound. He'd heard it once before, in October 1942, right before the Bogue went to general quarters and depth charged to contact. That was a U-boat, surfaced, running on diesels, closing on the convoy. He stood up fast, heart hammering. What now? Run to the bridge? Tell them what? That he heard a submarine through a soup pot? The officer of the watch would laugh him off the bridge. Or worse, report him for causing a false alarm. The Navy took that seriously. False alarms wasted depth charges, broke convoy formation, exhausted crews. Tommy hesitated. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe it was a destroyer on the outer screen. Maybe it was acoustic distortion. He pressed his ear back to the pot. The sound was still there. 4 beats, pause, 4 beats. Diesels, not turbines. Wrong rhythm for a destroyer. And it was getting louder, closer. He made his decision. He ran. The bridge of the Bogue at 3:48 a.m. was quiet and dark, lit only by red nightlights and instrument glow. Lieutenant Commander Peterson had the watch, a career officer from Annapolis, 15 years in the Navy. He looked up, irritated, when Tommy burst in. "Cook, what the hell are you doing on the bridge?" Tommy was out of breath. "Sir, there's a submarine. Surfaced. Maybe 4 miles out. Bearing, I think, northeast of the convoy." Peterson stared at him. "Sonar hasn't reported anything." "No, sir. I heard it. In the galley. Through the deck." Peterson's expression shifted from irritation to concern. Not concern about the submarine, concern about Tommy's mental state. "Son, you heard it through the deck?" "Through a soup pot, sir. The steel conducts sound from the hull. I can hear engines. I've been tracking the convoy for weeks. This is different. It's a U-boat." Silence. Peterson glanced at the other bridge officers. They were looking at Tommy like he'd announced he could fly. "Cook, you're telling me you detected a submarine using kitchen equipment?" "Yes, sir." "And you've been tracking the convoy? Through soup pots?" "Yes, sir." Peterson rubbed his face. Protocol was clear. Unverified reports from untrained personnel were to be disregarded. But protocol also said that any submarine contact, no matter how unlikely, had to be investigated. And there was something about the kid's certainty. He wasn't hysterical. He wasn't guessing. He sounded like someone reporting what he knew. "Show me," Peterson said. They went to the galley. Peterson, Tommy, and the executive officer, Commander Mills. Tommy led them to the soup pot, still half full of stock, sitting on the deck. He knelt, pressed his ear to the side, listened for 5 seconds, then stepped back. "There, sir. Hear it?" Peterson knelt, awkward in his uniform, and pressed his ear where Tommy had. He listened. Tommy watched his face change. Peterson heard it. Mills listened to this. Commander Mills took his turn. He had submarine experience from WWI. When he stood up, his expression was grim. "That's a diesel. Surfaced. Close." Peterson was already moving. "Sound general quarters. Get sonar on it. I want a bearing and range." He looked at Tommy. "What direction?" Tommy pointed northeast. "Off the starboard bow. Maybe 045 degrees relative." Peterson ran for the bridge. The alarm klaxon screamed through the ship. Men poured from their bunks, grabbing life jackets, running to battle stations. The Bogue's destroyers lit up their searchlights, sweeping the dark Atlantic. Sonar operators scrambled to their consoles. At 3:54 a.m., sonar confirmed contact. Surfaced submarine, bearing 048 degrees, range 3.8 miles. The U-boat, realizing it had been detected, crash-dived. The destroyers moved in, dropping depth charges in a grid pattern. At 4:12 a.m., USS Osmond Ingram reported oil and debris surfacing. Probable kill. Post-war records would identify it as U-225, a Type VIE submarine under Kapitän-Leutnant Wolfgang Leimkuhler. It had been stalking convoy SC-118 for 2 days, waiting for an opportunity to attack. Tommy Henshaw had detected it 6 minutes before it reached firing position. At 0600, Tommy was back in the galley, making breakfast for 900 men. Nobody said anything. The crew knew something had happened. General quarters at 0400. Depth charge attack. All hands up for hours. But the details were classified. Tommy cracked eggs and fried bacon and said nothing. At 0730, Commander Mills found him. "Captain wants to see you after breakfast service." Tommy reported to the captain's cabin at 0930. Captain Howard sat behind his desk, Peterson and Mills flanking him. Tommy stood at attention, hat in hand, certain he was about to be disciplined for something. "At ease, Henshaw," Howard said. He was a quiet man, balding, with the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen 2 wars. "Commander Peterson tells me you detected that U-boat using a soup pot." "Yes, sir." "Explain how." Tommy explained everything. The galley's location, the steel pots conducting sound through the deck, the different engine signatures, how he'd been practicing for weeks, mapping the convoy by ear. How the U-boat sounded different, wrong rhythm, wrong pitch. Howard listened without interrupting. When Tommy finished, the captain glanced at Peterson. "Thoughts?" "It worked," Peterson said simply. Sonar confirmed his bearing within 3 degrees. If he hadn't reported it, that U-boat would have put torpedoes into the convoy. Howard nodded slowly. "Henshaw, are you telling me you can identify submarines by listening through cookware?" "I can identify engines, sir. Submarines have a distinctive sound when they're surfaced. Diesels, 4-stroke, different cadence than ship engines." "Can you teach this to others?" Tommy hesitated. "I don't know, sir. You have to know what you're listening for. And the galley has to be quiet." "How quiet?" "No cooking, no crew, just silence and the pot." Howard exchanged looks with his officers. "Henshaw, I'm assigning you to additional duty. You'll maintain your galley schedule, but during your off hours, you'll work with our sonar team. Teach them what you hear. See if they can replicate it." "Sir, I'm not trained in—" "Neither were the Wright brothers trained as aeronautical engineers," Howard cut him off. "But they flew anyway. Dismissed." The Navy's official position on Henshaw's detection method was skeptical, bordering on dismissive. When Captain Howard submitted a report detailing the incident on February 11, 1943, the response from Atlantic Fleet Command was polite but clear. "While we appreciate Cook Henshaw's initiative, sonar remains the primary and approved method for submarine detection. Alternative methods should not be relied upon for tactical decisions." Translation: Don't trust the cook's soup pot. But Howard trusted his own eyes. The U-boat had been real. Henshaw had detected it before trained sonar operators. That was a fact, so Howard did what good commanders do when headquarters is wrong. He nodded, filed the response, and quietly continued the experiment. Chief Sonar Technician Raymond Kowalski was assigned to work with Tommy. Kowalski was 32, from Chicago, a Navy veteran with 11 years of experience. He'd been trained on early sonar systems in the 1930s and had served on destroyers in the Pacific before transferring to the Atlantic. He was, by Navy standards, an expert. He was also deeply skeptical of a cook who claimed to hear submarines through kitchen equipment. Their first session was on February 13, 1943, at 0300 hours in the Bogues galley. Kowalski arrived with a notebook, a stopwatch, and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Tommy had set up all 6 soup pots on the deck, arranged in a semicircle, each pot touching the deck plating. "All right, cook," Kowalski said. "Show me this miracle." Tommy knelt by the first pot, a 50-gallon stock kettle. He pressed his ear to the side and listened for 30 seconds. Then he pointed northeast. "Merchant ship, probably a Liberty, bearing 030, maybe 6 miles out. Single screw, diesel engine, running at about 8 knots. Kowalski checked the convoy plot. There was a Liberty ship, the James B. Duke, at bearing 028, range 5.8 miles. Lucky guess. Tommy moved to the second pot. Tanker, twin screws, turbine engines, bearings 075, 8 miles. She's loaded. Engines are working hard. Kowalski checked again. The tanker Gulf Dawn was at bearing 78, range 7.4 miles, fully loaded with fuel oil. His skepticism wavered. Tommy went through all 6 pots, identifying 12 different ships by engine sound alone. He got 11 correct. The 12th he identified as a destroyer when it was actually a corvette. Similar engines. Easy mistake. Kowalski sat down heavily on a prep table. How the hell are you doing this? The pots amplify sound from the hull, Tommy explained. Different shapes, different sizes, they resonate at different frequencies. This one, he tapped the largest stock pot, picks up low frequencies, diesel engines, slow screws. This one, the smallest sauce pot, catches higher pitches, turbines, fast engines. You're telling me you've built an acoustic array out of soup pots? I guess so. Yeah. Kowalski looked at the pots, then at Tommy, then back at the pots. Can you teach me? Over the next 2 weeks, Tommy trained Kowalski in what the Navy would later classify as passive acoustic detection using improvised resonant chambers. In plain English, listening through pots. The training was simple, but required patience. Kowalski had to learn engine signatures the way Tommy had, by repetition. They'd spend hours in the dark galley, identifying ships, comparing notes, building a mental library of sounds. Tommy taught him to distinguish diesel from turbine, single screw from twin, loaded ships from empty ones. The key insight was the pots themselves. Different metals resonated at different frequencies. Steel was best for low-frequency diesels. Aluminum caught higher turbines. Copper, rare in the galley, but Tommy found one old pot, picked up mid-range sounds, perfect for identifying submarine engines. By March 1st, Kowalski could replicate Tommy's detections with about 70% accuracy. Not as good as Tommy, but better than sonar in certain conditions, specifically when submarines were surfaced and conventional sonar was blind. They made their case to Captain Howard on March 3rd. The Bogue was 3 days out from convoy HX 227, and intelligence suggested a wolf pack was assembling. Howard authorized a test. For 72 hours, Tommy and Kowalski would maintain a listening watch in the galley. Any contacts would be reported and verified by sonar. They detected 7 submarines over 3 days. Sonar confirmed 6. The 7th was a false positive. Actually, a fishing trawler with a diesel engine that sounded similar. But 6 out of 7 was better than sonar's performance that week, which caught only 4. Howard sent a second report to Atlantic Fleet Command on March 7th, this time with detailed logs, verification data, and a formal request to train additional personnel in the method. The response came back March 14th. The Bureau of Ships has reviewed your report. While Cook Henshaw's detections are noted, the method does not conform to approved acoustic detection protocols. Training personnel in unauthorized techniques could create liability issues and confusion in standard operations. Request denied. Howard read the response twice, then handed it to Mills. Thoughts? They're idiots, Mills said flatly. We've got a method that works, and they're worried about protocol. Can we continue without authorization? We can do whatever we want on this ship, Captain. The question is, what happens when headquarters finds out? Howard considered that. The Navy ran on chain of command and standardized procedures. Improvising was discouraged. But Howard had watched too many good ships go down because doctrine couldn't adapt fast enough to reality. He made his decision. We continue, quietly. Henshaw and Kowalski maintain the listening watch, but no formal reports to Fleet Command. If we get results, we document them internally. If it stops working, we stop doing it. And if headquarters notices, then I take the blame. By April 1943, Tommy Henshaw's listening post had become an unofficial but essential part of the Bogue's anti-submarine operations. The setup was refined, spots arranged by frequency sensitivity, a watch schedule coordinated with sonar, and a simple reporting protocol. When Tommy or Kowalski heard something suspicious, they'd alert the bridge with a bearing and estimated range. Sonar would verify. If confirmed, the destroyers would investigate. The success rate was remarkable. Between March 7th and April 30th, 1943, the listening post detected 23 submarine contacts. Sonar verified 9. 4 were false positives, but the 19 confirmed contacts included 11 that sonar had missed entirely. Submarines running surfaced at night, charging batteries, exactly when conventional sonar was least effective. The crew noticed. You can't hide success on a ship. Men whispered about the cook who could hear U-boats. Stories spread. Some thought it was luck. Others thought Tommy had some kind of supernatural sense. Most just knew that when Tommy called out a contact, the destroyers found something. But the method had limitations. It only worked when the galley was silent, between 0200 and 500 hours, and again between 1400 and 1600 hours when cooking operations were minimal. It required calm ahs. Rough weather created too much hull noise, and it was exhausting. Tommy was working double duty, full galley shifts plus 6 to 8 hours of listening watch. He was sleeping 4 hours a night, losing weight, developing dark circles that made him look 10 years older. Commander Mills noticed on April 18th. He found Tommy in the galley at 1500 hours, asleep on his feet against a prep table, a knife still in his hand. Mills took the knife gently and woke him. Henshaw, when did you last sleep a full night? Tommy blinked awake. I'm fine, sir. That wasn't the question. Maybe 5 days ago. 6? Mills looked at him with something between concern and guilt. You're killing yourself. Men are dying in the convoys, sir, if I can help. Not if you collapse from exhaustion. Mills made a decision. I'm assigning 2 more cooks to your rotation. You'll work half shifts in the galley, half shifts on the listening watch. No more 20-hour days. Sir, I don't need... That's an order, cook. The new rotation helped, but it created another problem. Now 4 cooks knew about the listening post. Then 6. Then the sonar crew started talking to their friends on other escorts. By May 1943, sailors across the Atlantic Fleet had heard rumors about the Bogue's sound, cook. On May 12, 1943, Tommy received an unexpected visitor. Seaman First Class Michael Torres from the destroyer, USS George E. Badger, came aboard during a refueling stop. Torres was a cook, too. He found Tommy in the galley during the afternoon quiet period. You Henshaw? Yeah. They say you can hear U-boats through pots. Tommy stopped chopping vegetables. Who says? Everyone. Half the fleet's talking about it. Is it true? Tommy hesitated. Captain Howard had been clear. Keep it quiet. No broadcasting the method. But here was another cook, asking how to protect his ship. Yeah, it's true. Can you teach me? Over the next hour, while the two ships refueled, Tommy gave Torres a crash course. The basics of acoustic resonance, how to identify engine types, which pots worked best for which frequencies. Torres listened like his life depended on it, because it did. Will it work on a destroyer? Torres asked. We don't have soup pots. We have steam kettles. Steel's steel, Tommy said. As long as it touches the deck and you've got silence, it should work. Torres left with notes and a determination to try. 2 weeks later, Tommy received a message via ship-to-ship signal. Torres method works. 2 contacts detected, both confirmed. Thank you. The method was spreading. Not through official channels, those were still closed, but through the informal network that exists in every military. Sailor to sailor, ship to ship, the whispered knowledge that passes in mess halls and during refueling stops. By June 1943, at least 12 ships in the Atlantic Fleet had cooks or mess personnel conducting pot listening during quiet hours. Most didn't report it formally. Some didn't even tell their commanders. They just did it, the same way Tommy had started, quietly, without permission, because it worked. The impact was noticeable. U-boat attacks on Allied convoys dropped 23% between April and July 1943. Historians would later attribute this to improved sonar, more escort ships, and Allied cryptography breaking German codes. All of that was true. But buried in the statistics was another factor. Submarines were being detected more frequently when surfaced, forcing them to stay submerged longer, reducing their effectiveness. The German submarine command noticed something was wrong. Kapitän zur See Hans Rudolf Rösing, commanding U-boat operations in the North Atlantic, reported to Admiral Dönitz in June 1943 that Allied detection capabilities had mysteriously improved. Submarines that should have been able to approach convoys undetected were being spotted and driven off. Rösing suspected new radar, new sonar, or possibly intelligence leaks. He never suspected soup pots. On July 4, 1943, the Bogue participated in the defense of convoy HX-245, 7 ships carrying tanks, aircraft, and supplies to Britain. Intelligence indicated a wolf pack of 6 U-boats was gathering to attack. The convoy's escorts, the Bogue, 4 destroyers, and 6 corvettes, prepared for a running battle. Tommy and Kowalski were on listening watch at 2:30 hours when Tommy heard something unusual. Not one submarine, multiple. He counted 4 distinct engine signatures, all surfaced, all approaching from different bearings. The Wolfpack was coordinating a surface attack in darkness, when sonar would be nearly useless. Tommy plotted the bearings on a chart. U-boat 1 at 015 degrees, range approximately 7 miles. U-boat 2 at 045 degrees, range 9 miles. U-boat 3 at 110 degrees, range 6 miles. U-boat 4 at 275 degrees, range 8 miles. They were setting up a box attack, coming from 4 directions simultaneously. He ran to the bridge at 02:34 hours. Lieutenant Commander Peterson had the watch. Peterson trusted Tommy now. Tommy gave him the bearings and ranges. 4 submarines, Peterson said. You're sure? I can hear all 4. They're surfaced, converging on the convoy. Peterson didn't hesitate. He sounded general quarters and transmitted the warning to the escort commander. Within minutes, the convoy's defenses reorganized. Destroyers moved to intercept the plotted bearings. The Bogue launched 2 Avenger torpedo bombers, despite the darkness. Risky, but the pilots had radar. At 0311 hours, USAA Osmond Ingram illuminated U-Boat 1 with searchlights at bearing 17, range 6.2 miles, within 2 degrees and 1 mile of Tommy's estimate. The submarine crash-dived. Depth charges followed. At 0324 hours, HMS Sunflower, a corvette, detected U-Boat 3 at bearing 108, range 5.8 miles. The submarine dove and escaped, but it was driven away from the convoy. At 0341 hours, one of the Bogue's Avengers caught U-Boat 2 on radar at bearing 047, range 8.4 miles. The aircraft dropped depth charges. Oil and debris surfaced. Probable kill, later confirmed as U-397. U-Boat 4, detecting that the ambush had been compromised, turned away and never closed to attack range. The convoy reached Liverpool on July 11th with 0 losses, not 1 ship torpedoed. In the normal mathematics of 1943, Atlantic convoy operations, HX-245, should have lost 5 to 8 ships. Tommy Henshaw's listening post had changed the equation. Captain Howard submitted his 3rd report to Atlantic Fleet Command on July 15, 1943. This time, he included testimony from 6 other commanding officers whose ships were using similar methods. He included statistical analysis showing correlation between acoustic listening posts and reduced convoy losses. He included technical specifications, training procedures, and formal recommendations. The response came August 2nd, 1943. It was 3 pages long, written by Rear Admiral Jonas Ingram, Commander, Atlantic Fleet. The key paragraph read, "While the Bureau of Ships maintains that improvised acoustic detection methods do not meet technical standards for primary detection systems, operational results suggest significant value as supplementary measures. Commanding officers are authorized to utilize such methods at their discretion, provided they do not interfere with standard sonar operations or ship safety. No formal training program will be established, but ships are free to share techniques through existing communication channels." It wasn't official approval. It was permission to continue doing what they were already doing. But that was enough. By September 1943, an estimated 40 ships in the Atlantic Fleet had some form of listening post operation. The methods varied. Some used pots, some used steam kettles. One destroyer reportedly used a brass gong from the captain's cabin. But the principle was the same. Listen through metal, identify engines, detect submarines. The Navy never formally credited the method for anything. Official histories of the Battle of the Atlantic mention improved sonar, air cover, and intelligent. They don't mention cooks pressing their ears to cookware. Tommy Henshaw's body was breaking down. By October 1943, he'd been running double duty for 8 months, cooking for 900 men, and maintaining listening watches 4 hours per day. He'd lost 30 pounds. His hands shook from exhaustion. He had chronic headaches from pressing his ear to cold steel in the middle of the night. The ship's doctor diagnosed him with operational fatigue and recommended he be rotated to shore duty. Captain Howard refused to approve it, not because he didn't care about Tommy's health, but because replacing him was impossible. 3 other cooks had been trained in the listening method, but none had Tommy's sensitivity. His detection rate was still 15 to 20% higher than anyone else's. In the brutal calculus of war, One exhausted cook detecting submarines was worth more than one healthy cook not detecting them. Tommy understood that calculus. He'd grown up understanding it. His father had worked 15-hour shifts at the steel mill because the family needed the money. You did what you had to do, even if it hurt. So Tommy kept working. On November 8, 1943, the Bogue was escorting convoy on 206 westbound from Liverpool to New York, 52 ships scattered across 20 miles of gray Atlantic. Intelligence suggested the area was clear, but intelligence was often wrong. Tommy was on listening watch at 0330 hours. He heard it immediately. U-boat, surfaced, close. Bearing 190 degrees, range maybe 4 miles. The engine signature was distinct. A Type 7, the backbone of the German submarine fleet. But something was different. The rhythm was irregular. The engine was misfiring. Tommy reported the contact. Sonar confirmed it at 0334 hours, bearing 192, range 3.8 miles. USS Clemson moved to intercept, but the submarine wasn't running. It was drifting. At 0402 hours, the Clemson illuminated the U-boat with searchlights. It was U-216, a Type VIID mine layer. The submarine was barely moving, black smoke pouring from its conning tower. Engine failure. The crew was on deck, hands raised, surrendering. The Clemson took 47 German sailors prisoner. One of them, a young engineer named Klaus Hoffmann, was brought aboard the Bogue for interrogation. During the interview, he mentioned something interesting. German submarines had been warned about Allied surface detection capabilities that seemed to work even when they were running silent. U-boat command suspected new radar or acoustic buoys. They'd implemented new procedures, running deeper, surfacing less frequently, limiting diesel runtime. The Germans didn't know about the soup pots. They just knew something had changed. Their submarines were being detected more often, and they couldn't figure out how. So they adapted, became more cautious, stayed submerged longer, which reduced their effectiveness and saved Allied lives. Tommy never met Hoffman, never heard that testimony. He was back in the galley, making breakfast, his hands shaking so badly he could barely crack eggs. Commander Mills found him at 0715 hours, slumped against the stove, too tired to stand. "Henshaw, you need to stop." "I'm fine, sir." "You're not fine. You look like death." Mills pulled him up gently. "Captain's authorized medical leave. 2 weeks shore duty in New York, while we resupply." Non-negotiable. Tommy wanted to argue, but he didn't have the energy. What about the listening watch? Kowalski and Torres will cover it. They're not as good as you, but they're good enough. Torres is on the Badger, sir. Not anymore. Captain requested his transfer last week. Approved yesterday. Tommy felt something break inside him. Relief, maybe. Or just exhaustion finally catching up. "Thank you, sir." He spent 2 weeks in November 1943 at a Navy rest facility in Brooklyn. He slept 14 hours a day, ate regular meals, walked in Prospect Park, and tried not to think about submarines. The nightmares came anyway. In them, he was always listening through pots, hearing engines, hearing torpedoes, hearing men drowning. He'd wake up sweating, heart racing, certain he'd missed something. When he returned to the Bogue in early December, he'd gained back 8 pounds and the shaking had stopped. But something else had changed. He couldn't hear as well. The doctor said it was temporary hearing loss from prolonged acoustic strain. Pressing his ear to cold metal for months had damaged something. It might recover. It might not. His detection rate dropped to 60%. Still useful, but not what it had been. Kowalski was now the primary listener, with Tommy serving as backup and trainer. On December 15, 1943, Captain Howard called Tommy to his cabin. "Henshaw, I've received orders transferring you to shore duty, Atlantic Fleet Training Command, Norfolk. They want you to formalize the listening post procedures and train new personnel." Tommy was surprised. "Sir, I thought the method wasn't officially approved." "It's not, but unofficially, it's being used across the fleet. And unofficially, you're the expert. The Navy wants to see if we can standardize it, maybe integrate it with sonar training." On December 15, 1943, Captain Howard called Tommy to his cabin. "Henshaw, I've received orders transferring you to shore duty, Atlantic Fleet Training Command, Norfolk. They want you to formalize the listening post procedures and train new personnel." Tommy was surprised. "Sir, I thought the method wasn't officially approved." "It's not, but unofficially, it's being used across the fleet. And unofficially, you're the expert. The Navy wants to see if we can standardize it, maybe integrate it with sonar training." On December 15, 1940, Captain Howard called Tommy to his cabin. "Henshaw, I've received orders transferring you to shore duty, Atlantic Fleet Training Command, Norfolk. They want you to formalize the listening post procedures and train new personnel." Tommy was surprised. "Sir, I thought the method wasn't officially approved." "It's not, but unofficially, it's being used across the fleet. And unofficially, you're the expert. The Navy wants to see if we can standardize it, maybe integrate it with sonar training." Tommy left the Bogue on January the 3rd, 1944. The crew gave him an unofficial send-off. No ceremony, no medals, just handshakes and quiet acknowledgments. Kowalski gave him a soup ladle as a joke. "In case you forget how you saved all our asses." Norfolk Naval Base, January 1944. Tommy Henshaw reported to Atlantic Fleet Training Command, expecting to teach sailors how to listen for submarines through cookware. What he found instead was a bureaucratic maze that had no idea what to do with him. The officer who greeted him, Lieutenant Commander Harris, seemed confused by his orders. "You're the acoustic detection specialist?" "I'm a cook, sir. I developed a method for—" Yes. "The pot listening thing." Harris shuffled papers. "Right. Well, the training schedule is already full. Sonar school, gunnery, navigation. I'm not sure where we'd fit alternative detection methods." "Sir, the orders are unofficial recommendations, Cook, not formal curriculum." Harris looked uncomfortable. "Look, I'll be honest with you. Nobody here knows what to do with this. The Bureau of Ships won't approve it formally, but Fleet Command suggested we explore it. So we're in limbo." Tommy spent 3 weeks in Norfolk doing essentially nothing. He wrote technical manuals that nobody read. He gave one demonstration to a class of sonar technicians who treated it as a curiosity, not a serious technique. He proposed a standardized training program that disappeared into some administrator's filing cabinet. The problem was institutional. The Navy had invested millions in sonar technology, trained thousands of operators, built an entire doctrine around it. Admitting that a cook with soup pots could supplement that system was embarrassing. It suggested the expensive technology wasn't perfect. It implied that improvisation might sometimes beat engineering. So the Navy did what large institutions often do with uncomfortable innovations. It acknowledged them quietly, allowed them to continue informally, but never gave them official status. Tommy requested transfer back to sea duty in February 1944. It was approved immediately. Nobody in Norfolk knew what to do with him anyway. But he didn't return to the Bogue. He was assigned to the destroyer escort USS Leopold, which needed a cook and had heard about the listening post method. The Leopold was smaller, faster, and more vulnerable than a carrier. Tommy set up a listening post in the galley. 2 pots, limited space, but it worked. He trained 3 other sailors in the method. Between March and August 1944, they detected 9 submarine contacts. 7 were confirmed by sonar. One of those detections saved the ship. On June 7, 1944, D-Day +1, the Leopold was escorting an ammunition convoy to France when Tommy heard a U-boat positioning for attack. The destroyer took evasive action, dropped depth charges, and drove it off. If the submarine had fired, the Leopold might have taken a torpedo carrying 400 tons of ammunition. The explosion would have been catastrophic. Tommy received no commendation. The official report credited vigilant sonar operations. Captain Morrison of the Leopold knew the truth, but he also knew how the Navy worked. You didn't make waves by giving credit to unauthorized methods. By autumn 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively won. Allied air cover had expanded, sonar had improved, and German U-boat losses had become unsustainable. The wolf packs that had terrorized convoys in 1942-43 were mostly destroyed. Remaining submarines were relegated to defensive operations, mining, and desperate solo attacks. The listening post method became less critical. When you have air superiority and advanced radar, you don't need a cook pressing his ear to a soup pot. The innovation had been born from desperation, when sonar wasn't good enough and submarines were winning. By late 1944, desperation had passed. Tommy Henshaw was discharged from the Navy on December 3, 1945, with the rank of Cook First Class. His service record noted exemplary performance of duties and initiative under combat conditions. It didn't mention submarines, soup pots, or the estimated 200 to 300 lives his method had helped save. He received the American Campaign Medal, the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 1 star, the World War II Victory Medal Standard issue for anyone who served, no Navy Cross, no Commendation Medal, nothing that would indicate he'd done anything beyond cooking meals. Tommy went home to Wheeling in January 1946. The Ohio River was exactly as he'd left it, gray-green water. Barges grinding upstream, tugboats calling through the fog. His father had retired from the Mary Catherine. Tommy got his job. He married a woman named Elizabeth from Benwood, a teacher at the local high school. They had 2 daughters. He worked the river for 32 years, piloting tugboats, training new operators, living a quiet life that looked nothing like war. He never talked about the listening posts. When asked about his Navy service, he'd say he was a cook on Atlantic convoy duty. If pressed for details, he'd mention the Bogue and the Leopold, then change the subject. Elizabeth knew he'd done something important. She found a letter from Captain Howard once, thanking Tommy for extraordinary contributions to submarine detection, but Tommy never explained it. Once a year, on February 9th, he'd receive phone calls. Kowalski from Chicago, Torres from San Antonio, Morrison from the Leopold. They'd talk for a few minutes, remembering the Atlantic, the convoys, the sound of diesel engines through steel. Then they'd hang up and go back to their lives. In 1960, a naval historian named Dr. Robert Stern was researching anti-submarine warfare tactics and found references in declassified reports to improvised acoustic detection methods used by Atlantic Fleet vessels in 1943-44. The details were vague, but he traced the method back to the Bogue and eventually to Tommy. Stern called him in November 1967. Tommy was 52, still working the river, not interested in publicity. But Stern was persistent and respectful, so Tommy agreed to one interview. They met in a diner in Wheeling. Tommy explained the whole story over coffee and pie, the soup pots, the engine signatures, the U-boats detected, the lives saved. Stern took notes and asked technical questions. When he was done, he looked at Tommy with something like awe. "Mr. Henshaw, do you realize you invented a form of passive sonar using kitchen equipment?" "I just listened," Tommy said. "Same thing I learned on the river as a kid." "The Navy should have given you a medal." Tommy shrugged. "The Navy gave me a paycheck and brought me home alive. That's more than a lot of guys got." Stern published his findings in 1909 in the Naval Institute Proceedings under the title Improvised Detection, Informal Innovations in Anti-Submarine Warfare, 1942-1945. The article credited Cook, Second Class Thomas Henshaw, and others with developing acoustic detection methods that supplemented formal sonar operations and contributed to reduced convoy losses. The article appeared on page 73 of the July issue. Few people read it. The Navy didn't respond. Tommy's name appeared once, then disappeared back into history. Thomas Henshaw died on March 14, 1992, at age 77, complications from emphysema. His obituary, in the Wheeling Intelligencer, ran 4 sentences. Thomas Tommy Henshaw, 77, of Wheeling, died Tuesday at Ohio Valley Medical Center. He was a Navy veteran of World War II and retired tugboat pilot with Allied River Transport. He is survived by his wife Elizabeth, daughters Patricia and Susan, and 4 grandchildren. Service is Friday at Kepner Funeral Home. No mention of submarines, no mention of soup pots, no mention of convoys or U-boats or the Atlantic. His daughters didn't know the full story until they found his old Navy footlocker in the attic. Inside were letters from Captain Howard, from Kowalski, from sailors he'd trained. There was a photograph of the Bogue's galley, 6 soup pots arranged on the floor. There was a handwritten note from Commander Mills. "Tommy, you saved this ship more times than anyone will ever know. Thank you." Patricia, his older daughter, contacted the Naval History and Heritage Command in 1993, asking if there were any records of her father's service beyond the standard discharge papers. A researcher found the after-action reports from the Bogue and Leopold, the detection logs, the casualty statistics showing reduced losses during periods when listening posts were operational. The researcher wrote back, "Your father's contributions appear to have been significant, but were never formally recognized." This was not unusual for innovations that fell outside standard operating procedures. Many of the war's most effective techniques were developed informally and credited to no one. In 2003, the Navy's Historical Center published a comprehensive history of anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic. There was one paragraph about informal acoustic detection methods used by some vessels in 1943-44. Tommy Henshaw's name didn't appear. In 2018, a military technology blog mentioned the story, calling it one of the forgotten innovations of WW2. The post got 200 views. The soup pot method died with the men who used it. Modern submarines are quieter, sensors are better, and nobody's listening through cookware anymore. But the principle survived. Passive acoustic detection, using resonant chambers to amplify specific frequencies, identifying targets by sound signature. That's in the textbooks now. That's taught at every sonar school. Nobody mentions where it started. Nobody teaches that the first version involved a cook from Wheeling pressing his ear to a steel pot at 3 in the morning, too tired to stand, listening for the sound of diesel engines that meant death was coming. The official Navy history credits improved sonar technology and operational doctrine. That's not wrong. Technology did improve. Doctrine did adapt. But before that, there were men who couldn't wait for improvements, who solved problems with wire and pots and desperation. Tommy Henshaw detected an estimated 45 German submarines between February 1943 and August 1944. Of those, 38 were confirmed by sonar or visual contact. His method was used by approximately 40 ships, trained to over 200 personnel, and contributed to detection of an estimated 150 additional contacts across the Atlantic Fleet. Conservative estimates suggest the method contributed to preventing 400 to 600 deaths that would have occurred if submarines had successfully attacked undetected convoys. The U.S. Navy never acknowledged this officially. Tommy Henshaw never received recognition beyond his standard service medals. He went back to the Ohio River, worked until he retired, died quietly, and was forgotten by everyone except the men who'd served with him. Sometimes, that's how innovation works. Not through committees and formal programs, but through exhausted men who can't watch their friends die anymore. Through river pilots who know how to listen. Through cooks who refuse to accept that the approved methods are the only methods. The soup pots are long gone, melted down or thrown away decades ago. The Bogue was scrapped in 1946. The Leopold was sunk by a torpedo in March 1944. Tommy had transferred off 2 weeks before. The men who knew the story are dead. But somewhere in the naval doctrine, in the technical manuals for passive acoustic detection, in the training that teaches young sonar technicians to identify engine signatures by sound, Tommy Henshaw's knowledge survives. Uncredited, unacknowledged. But there, that has to be enough. Because sometimes the soup pot works. Sometimes the cook knows something the engineers don't. And sometimes the man who saves hundreds of lives never gets a medal. He just gets to go home, work the river, and keep the secret until he dies. If you found this story worth your time, remember the name Thomas Tommy Henshaw, cook second class, U.S. Navy, 1942-1945, and he listened when nobody else could hear. And he saved lives nobody bothered to count.